For years now, Tim and myself have harped on about Intel's loosely defined power specifications and how much of an issue they can be for customers. We've made several videos discussing this problem, but little has changed. With the release of 12th Gen, we did get some clarification from Intel on how the K-SKU parts are meant to run, that being PL1 equals PL2 at 253 watts, and yet this isn't how all or even most boards run out of the box with XMP loaded. In fact, just 5 months ago now, I looked at some new Intel Z790 motherboards from the likes of Asus, ASRock, MSI, and Gigabyte, and part of the title for that video read, "Stock power limits are still a mess." And a mess they were, with some of the cheaper boards limiting the Core i9 to just 3.75 GHz, while other boards clocked 50% higher to 5.6 GHz. Though this particular issue is caused by weak VRMs, but really it is all connected. The problem now is 13th and 14th gen K-SKU processors have started crashing when gaming, presumably due to silicon degradation. And Intel's trying to avoid blame for this situation that they created and are unfairly blaming their board partners in the process. They're caught in a lie and we have the receipts to prove it, but before we get into it, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Antec and the new Constellation series of ATX cases. The C8 comprises both ARGB and non-ARGB models, with both black and white variants available. The C8 ARGB features a seamless 45-degree beveled glass edge, giving it that popular minimalist design, while also providing a dual chamber for independent cooling. It also comes with a pair of 160mm Tranquil Reverse ARGB PWM fans and a single 140mm fan with a built-in fan control hub that can be synced directly with your motherboard. The top, bottom, and right sides can accommodate a trio of 360mm radiators simultaneously for those who want to ensure ample cooling or just go nuts with their ARGB. Or for those of you who aren't particular fans of RGB effects, there is a non-ARGB version available as well. So, for more information and to check out the rest of Antec's range, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so weak VRM performance aside, the default power specs for these Z790 boards were all over the place. Most of the boards had no real limits, with MSI allowing the Core i9 CPU to clock as high as the clock multiplier tables would allow, so that being 5.5 to 5.6 GHz for the P cores, under extended all-core workloads, resulting in a package power draw of 320 to 350 watts. Gigabyte were a little more conservative with a 280 watt long-term power limit, which dropped the Core i9 processor to 4.1 GHz on the P cores. Asus, on the other hand, they changed their power profile depending on the board and its VRM quality, but of the boards we tested, they ran at a max official Intel spec of 253 watts. ASRock tailor their default behavior depending on the board quality. The Phantom Gaming Z790 Nova, for example, that had no power limits at all, like what MSI does, while the Riptide model, that was limited to 253 watts, more like what we were seeing from Asus at the time. Now, you could blame the motherboard makers for this mess, but really it is on Intel to clearly define a power specification and not just give a series of recommended settings or a very broad range of possible settings. And to be very clear, this isn't a new issue. It's been ongoing for the better part of a decade now, and Intel has done little to improve things. Moreover, we know for a fact that Intel doesn't consider boards running without power limits to be out of spec, and they have clearly told us and other tech media outlets in the past that this is an in-spec behavior. And towards the end of the video, I will provide some evidence of this. Before that though, you might be wondering, why would Intel allow this? Why would Intel let board makers get away without enforcing any power limits? It's simple really. By not power limiting, you get more performance. And more performance means better results, and better results mean Intel might win some more gaming benchmarks. And Intel really wants to win gaming benchmarks, as does AMD. And for the most part, this hasn't been an issue. Sure, Intel's flagship processors do end up consuming a lot more power, and as a result do run really hot, but even at 253 watts, they're still very power hungry, because, 253 watts is quite a lot of power, especially when a 7950X 3D sucks down half as much. Therefore, Intel's not winning any efficiency awards, so they might as well go all out in an effort to try and snag a few benchmarks. So that's the power specification situation, though recently there has been some major developments here. About a month ago now, we started hearing reports of Intel CPUs crashing when gaming, with claims that 13th and 14th Gen K-SKU parts were unstable. Even Nvidia chimed in on this issue, placing the blame squarely on Intel CPUs, and suggested that users underclock their systems to avoid these stability issues. And by this point, Intel had got involved, claiming an investigation was underway. Shortly after that, we started to receive BIOS updates from the likes of ASUS that included the new Intel baseline profile, and since then Gigabyte has also rolled out their update. Now, it is important to note that not all 13th and 14th Gen K-SKU processors are suffering instability issues, and really we're not exactly sure how widespread the issue is, though user reports online are numerous. It does sound as though silicon degradation is a concern here, with CPUs being pushed too aggressively by default, leading to rapid degradation that sees them no longer able to maintain stability when using the default settings. This is of course speculation on our behalf, and of course Intel isn't going to tell us what's actually going on, but all available information does suggest that something like this is taking place. So with the new BIOS updates publicly available for ASUS and Gigabyte motherboards that include the Intel baseline profile, I wanted to run some tests to see what's changed and how it influences performance. Firstly, how do you enable the Intel baseline profile? Well, with the ASUS boards, it's the very first option in the AI tweaker menu. With this profile enabled, the ASUS multi-core enhancement feature is disabled, SVID behavior is set to Intel's failsafe, and IATDC current limit is set to Intel's default. The PL1 and PL2 targets remain the same once enabled, so that is to say the board runs at 253 watts using the baseline profile. Now for the Gigabyte boards, you do have to do a bit more digging to find the Intel baseline profile option. First you need to click into the Advanced Mode tab, then enter the Tweaker menu, then click Advanced CPU Settings, and then finally scroll down to the Turbo Power Limits option, hit Enter, and then select the Intel Baseline option. Once you've done this, it sets the PL1 to just 125 watts, and PL2 to 188 watts, and that was what it did with our 14900K, so that's a significant reduction from stock, which sees the board run at a sustained 280 watts. So what I want to do is compare the Intel baseline profile modes on the ASUS and Gigabyte boards to the non-power limited results from the MSI MPG Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi. For testing, I'll be using our Core i9 14900K with DDR5 7200 memory on the ASUS ROG Strix Z790-A Gaming Wi-Fi 2 and the Gigabyte Z790 Master X. For the graphics card, we will use the ASUS Strix RTX 4090, as that'll work nicely, and the focus here is mostly on gaming performance. So, let's get into it. Firstly though, let's take a look at an all-core workload with Cinebench 2024, and I have some single-core data as well. Without any power limits, the 14900K scores 2,268 points, which is a great result. Now, enabling the Intel baseline profile on the ASUS board reduced that score by 9%, so not a massive difference, but certainly a performance downgrade. That said, while we are seeing a 9% reduction in performance, the package power dropped by a much more significant 19%. So that is a massive power saving there, and it helped the 14900K avoid thermal throttling with a 360mm AO cooler. Then the Gigabyte board, which enforces much lower power limits when running the Intel baseline profile. Here, multi-core performance has dropped by a whopping 25% when compared to the MSI MPG Z790 Carbon Wi-Fi, which of course is running no power limits. It's also a 20% reduction when compared to the ASUS Intel baseline profile, so I have no idea why that is. It could simply be a bug, not exactly sure, but Gigabyte has rolled these BIOSes out and this is what they're doing. But it does make me a little bit confused as to what the real Intel baseline profile is meant to be. Now, these extreme power limitations saw the P cores running at just 3.9 GHz, and that's a 28% reduction when compared to the MSI board. So the results that we got make sense. It's pretty extreme stuff, but let's see what this all means for gamers. Starting with Baldur's Gate 3, previously we had the Core i9 14900K at 174 FPS with the medium preset and 155 FPS with Ultra. We're only looking at a 2 to 3% performance drop with the ASUS board running the baseline profile, so that's good, while the Gigabyte board is a more significant 5 to 6% slower. Still not an alarming performance drop-off, though that result does make the 14900K just 2% faster than a Core i5 14600K running without power limits. And worse than that, it makes AMD's 7800X3D 21% faster here. Cyberpunk 2077 is a very CPU demanding game, so I'm interested to check out the results here. The Asus board was 4% slower for the medium preset and then 7% slower with Ultra, which makes sense as Ultra places more load on the CPU with increased crowd density. So that's a pretty big drop off, but it's nothing compared to the Gigabyte board. Using the Ultra settings, the Gigabyte board running the baseline profile is 14% slower, allowing the RTX 4090 to render just 143 FPS, which makes it slower than a 13600K and most of the Zen 4 range. Testing with Hogwarts Legacy, we were previously seeing 137 FPS using the 14900K on our MSI motherboard without power limits, so the out-of-the-box default behavior for that particular board. With the baseline profile enabled on the Asus board, performance dropped by 5% using the ultra quality settings. Then with the Gigabyte board, we're looking at an 11% reduction in performance, so the drop for the Asus board, it's not that significant, but it is very problematic on the Gigabyte board. The Last of Us Part 1 is much the same using the Intel baseline profile on the Asus board. We're looking at a mere 1% reduction here. Then on the Gigabyte board, we're looking at a 4% reduction, though the power limits here are really hurting the 1% lows, which did drop by 16%, so that's pretty significant. Next up, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and the Epic preset on the Asus board is 6% slower than the unlimited power config, or 11% slower when comparing 1% lows. Then for the Gigabyte board, we're looking at an 11% reduction to the average frame rate and a 20% hit to the 1% lows. So again, the performance loss on the Gigabyte board with the baseline profile power values is concerning. ACC isn't a very CPU demanding game, but even so, we are seeing some performance loss. The Asus board is just 3% slower, while we are seeing double-digit losses for the Gigabyte board as frame rates dipped by 10%. Spider-Man Remastered is also not that CPU demanding, and here the Asus board running the baseline profile is 5% slower, while the Gigabyte board is 9% slower. The performance drop-off in Watch Dogs Legion isn't that significant, even for the Gigabyte board, which was just 3% slower than the unlimited power config. And then finally, we have Starfield, and here the Asus board was just 3% slower, or 6% slower when using the less GPU-bound medium quality settings. Then we see when using the medium settings on the Gigabyte board, it's 13% slower, or 11% slower when using Ultra. So there you have it. For the most part, you shouldn't be seeing a significant reduction in performance. That is assuming that you have a board that still runs at 253 watts with the Intel baseline profile enabled, as we were seeing on the Asus board. The Gigabyte take on the Intel baseline profile is very confusing to me, and I'm not sure why or how they've come up with the power limits they have, or if it's perhaps just simply a bug and they're not identifying the processor correctly. It is a beta BIOS after all, so I guess we'll have to wait and see if they make any changes in the future. Looking up the 13th and 14th gen datasheet, you'll find that Intel's base spec for the 14900K is PL1 at 125 watts and PL2 at 253 watts, and neither the Asus or Gigabyte boards are running at that spec for their Intel baseline profile. So as usual, it seems as though none of Intel's board partners know what to do with their power specs, or rather it's more of a case that they're really free to do whatever they want with the power specs, and we've always known this to be the case. And to be fair to the partners, it is a bit confusing, though I'm sure they understand what they're doing here, as the spec for 8 P cores and 16 E cores for 125 watt processors calls for a 125 watt / 253 watt configuration, while the extreme config, whatever that is, I assume that is for K-SKU parts, calls for a 253 watt / 253 watt configuration. So PL1 equals PL2 at 253 watts, which is what we understand to be the default spec, but again, there is multiple specifications, and again, we've known this for a long time. Now, Gigabyte has released a blog detailing their implementation of the Intel baseline profile on their Z790 and B760 motherboards. claiming superior stability with Gigabyte Beta BIOS. And they say the following: Gigabyte always prioritizes user experience, focusing on both performance and stability. Additionally, as a close ally of Intel, we promptly introduced the Intel baseline feature with the latest Beta BIOS. When using 13th and 14th generation K-SKU CPUs, the Intel baseline setting will appear in the Turbo Power Limits option under Advanced CPU Settings. After enabling Intel baseline, the performance will be expected to be limited due to power setting adjustments. So, it seems like Gigabyte has deliberately gone with the values that they have for the Intel baseline profile in an effort to maximize stability, but I'm not exactly sure what kind of process they've gone through to arrive at the numbers that they have. Have they tested degraded K-SKU parts and found that 253 watts for PL1 and PL2 is just still too much, requiring them to go down to 188 watts? Or do they feel degradation will still occur at 253 watts, and in order to avoid short-term degradation, a 188 watt limit is required? Surely that's not the case. I think it's probably more likely that Gigabyte has just messed up their profile altogether. Not exactly sure. And unfortunately, getting information out of Gigabyte has historically been very slow for us, and often when it comes to our VR and thermal content, getting accurate information is also difficult. So while I have reached out for some clarification, it might be some time before I get a reply. So needless to say, I have a lot of questions for both Intel and their board partners, and unfortunately most of them are going to go unanswered. There's a significant amount of information surrounding this topic that we could discuss, and much of it we really already have on the channel. So rather than spend about an hour discussing all the various different angles you can approach this topic from, I'm just going to answer a few simple questions that I think most of you will be asking at this point. First and foremost, I bet most of you want to know who is to blame, and I'm sure some of you have your own opinions on this, so let's get into it. The short answer is, everyone involved is to blame. So that is Intel and their board partners, but primarily Intel is really, they're the ones that the blame should be squarely placed on for this entire mess. It seems as though Intel's trying to have their cake and eat it too. They still want to push their CPUs as hard as possible, gaining top spot in the benchmarks, or at least getting as close as they can, and by doing so, they're potentially compromising the silicon, causing it to degrade at a significantly more rapid rate than expected. In the instances where stability has been compromised, for whatever reason that may be, Intel can now place the blame squarely on you because, you know, XMP and all that, it is overclocking and you can damage your processor doing that. But thanks to Intel, you now have a safe spec. The spec, the baseline profile, which you can now load up and it'll solve your problems for you. Well, maybe not your performance problems, but hey, the system should probably be stable now. No more crashing, fingers crossed. Again though, this isn't a new thing. Well, the compromised stability might be a new thing, but playing fast and loose with power configurations on Intel boards, that's not new. As I said earlier, this has been happening for the better part of a decade now, and Intel has done nothing about it because, you know, they call it in spec. To them, it hasn't been a problem. It's just been a thing you could do. Point is though, they've had years to address it if it was a problem, talk to their partners and sort it all out. But nothing's happened. Well, that is until it finally bit them in the backside and we're seeing the problem that we're seeing now. Now, earlier I did say that I have receipts to prove Intel is well aware and more than okay with boards running without power limits. Again, when we've asked Intel about this over the years, they've always told us that what we're seeing with these power limits removed and turbo timers removed is it's in spec behavior. And 4 years ago in an interview with Dr. Ian Cutress, they said just that. Ian Cutress asked, one of the things we've seen with the parts that we review is that we're taking consumer or workstation level motherboards from the likes of Asus, ASRock and such, and they're implementing their own values for that PL2 limit and also the turbo window. They might be pushing these values up until the maximum they can go, such as a limit of 999 watts for 4,096 seconds. From your opinion, does this distort how we do reviews because it necessarily means that they are running out of Intel-defined spec? Now, the Intel representative replied by saying, even with those values, you're not running out of spec. I want to be very clear, you're running in spec, but you are getting higher turbo duration. we're going to be very crisp in our definition of what the difference between in-spec and out-of-spec is. There is an overclocking bit flag on our processors. Any change that requires you to set that overclocking bit to enable overclocking is considered out-of-spec operation. So if the motherboard manufacturer leaves a processor with its regular turbo values, but states that the power limit is 999 watts, that does not require a change in the overclocking bit, so it is in spec. So what Intel's saying here is this: as long as their CPUs adhere to the default clock multiplier table, they don't care what the power limits or turbo duration is. Board makers are free to run the processors at their maximum performance. You're only actually overclocking the CPU when you start changing the clock multiplier ratios. And in that same interview, Intel also said the following: both PL2 and Tau are configurable by the OEM and ODM and are in spec. So you have the ability, of course, if the power delivery supports a higher power limit, and also if the system has the thermal capability to adjust these values. So motherboard manufacturers and ODMs are investing in their power delivery and thermal solutions to allow them to maximize performance or get a certain amount of turbo duration without throttling to the maximum extent possible. So again, they're very clearly saying here that there is no limit on PL2 and turbo timers. And they're also discussing a major problem we've seen with desktop motherboards that goes in the other direction. Because the Intel spec is so broadly defined, you can go the other way by creating a motherboard with a very weak, insufficient VRM that limits power to 125 watts, which we have seen, and although it completely cripples performance of most Intel CPUs, it is still technically in spec, and they can list support for the most flagship Core i9 parts. So, as we've been saying for years now, the entire thing is a mess, it's Intel's fault, and it is extremely anti-consumer. On that note, if your CPU can't run at a sustained 253 watts, so PL1 and PL2 equaling 253 watts, then it should be replaced by Intel. Anything short of that and they've misled customers. So far, it would seem as though Intel's blaming their partners with a recent statement made to Igor's lab. They said that the issue may be related to out-of-specification operating conditions resulting in sustained high voltage and frequency during periods of elevated heat. Intel requests system and motherboard manufacturers to provide end users with a default BIOS profile that matches Intel's recommended settings. They concluded by saying, Intel will be publishing a public statement regarding issue status and Intel recommended BIOS setting recommendations targeted for May 2024. So, as expected, it sounds like Intel's passing the blame for something they've known about for many years now and have admitted publicly it is in-spec behavior. This is the smoking gun that is no doubt going to land Intel in some seriously hot water. As for owners of Intel 13th and 14th gen K-SKU processors that haven't suffered any stability issues when running without power limits, which was in spec but now Intel's saying is out of spec, well, you can now ensure that your processor is running in the Intel spec, the new one, and not above it by just enabling these new profiles. And the good news is performance shouldn't suffer too much. And for those of you who were suffering stability issues, hopefully enforcing the 253 watt limit does solve that for you. And if not, you should be seeking a replacement processor. For now though, I'm going to wrap this video up, but of course, I will be following this situation, seeing how it develops, because we've been sort of doing that for years now, and I will be testing any further BIOS updates from Asus, Gigabyte, ASRock, and MSI. If you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up. This is a topic we have been, following and harping on about for a long time now. Interesting to see it come to a head like this. But yeah, if you appreciate it, maybe consider supporting us on Floatplane and Patreon, or Patreon. Pick one of those. Not both of them, just either will work. It'll give you access to exclusive monthly live streams where we talk very candid with you guys about situations like this and really address any of the questions you may have. We also have a Discord server where I've been keeping our Discord members up to date with this sort of testing, behind the scenes content, Q&As, a lot of cool stuff there. So check it out if you're interested, but if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.